Welcome to a Fragmentarium Video Conference. I'm your host, Bill Duba, Project Manager of Fragmentarium. Today I have the honor of presenting Professor Tuomas Heikkilä of Church History at the University of Helsinki. I will dispense with going through the impressive list of achievements and publications and merely note that he, along with Professor Oso Omundsson, edited the phenomenal volume Nordic Latin Manuscript Fragments, The Destruction and Reconstruction of Medieval Books, published with Routledge in 2017. It's an excellent work. And today, Professor Heikkilä will be presenting on the theme Fragments in Finland, Manuscript Culture at the Edge of the Latinitas. Professor Heikkilä, I invite you to take the floor.
Thank you very much. It is very flattering to be invited to this wonderful forum. And I could already see that there are many old friends already from the 90s. Brigitte, it's wonderful to see you. It has been 25 years. And Tuija Ainonen is here. She has been a vital part of this Finnish scholarly task force that has been studying the fragments during the past 10 years. And Jaakko Tahkokallio, another member of that group, promised to join us later on. And Gottfried Krönen, whom I know from the stomatological front, is there. So this is really wonderful to join you today. In Helsinki, it's very rainy, not very typical Finnish January weather, but it's even nicer to spend some quality time with you. The modest topic of today is to make you acquainted with the wonderfully vast number of parchment fragments located in the Nordic countries, that is in the 5 countries, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden and Finland. And during the Middle Ages, they were all part of actually 2 medieval realms, namely Denmark and Sweden. And my title is Manuscript Culture at the Edge of Latinitas. And later on, after having given you a introduction to the Nordic collections, I will then focus on the Finnish fragments. And I'm really happy, as I already said, that Tuija and Jaakko are present because they may have some detailed information that I may not have. I have actually 6 parts in my presentation, but don't worry, it shouldn't be too long. I will start with a prologue, and then we shall move on the question, what do we actually have in the Nordic fragment collections? And then we shall discuss briefly the mechanics, how the medieval books kind of were molded into fragments in the 16th and 17th century in the Nordic countries. And then we shall focus on the Finnish fragments, that is the fragments that are now located in Finland. And I shall say a couple of words about the ongoing projects, what we would like to achieve next, and then I shall finish with a flatitude. So let's start with a prologue. You are all enlightened people, and I'm sure you have no difficulties in locating, say, Iceland or Finland on the geographical map. Not even in a rather old geographical map. This is probably a map that is known to many of you. It is one of the very earliest maps representing the Nordic countries in more than less kind of similar fashion, well, representing the real life geography. But there are wonderful sea monsters, as you can see, and all kinds of nice creatures. And this is the Carta Marina by Olaus Magnus from 1539. So this is the area in which we are going to be for the next 50 minutes. And here you can find Finland, naturally. Present day Sweden is here. Norway. I hope you can actually see my, okay. And Denmark down here naturally, and you can have a glimpse of Iceland up there. So now we more or less know where we are. And I would like to start with a quotation from a book that Åslaug Åmundsen and myself edited a couple of years ago, and it was the first kind of somewhat bigger book on the Nordic Latin manuscript fragments. It was a pan-Nordic project that brought together the enterprises and achievements of many Nordic scholars and even British scholars on the Nordic fragments. And in the introductory part, Åslaug and I wrote, when looking towards the north, it is easy either to point to its provinciality or, on the other hand, to its uniqueness, as represented by the mysterious runestones, rich Icelandic sagas, or the incomprehensible language of the Finns. The ordinary manifestations of European book culture are all too easily overlooked. The liturgical books of the parish priests, the volumes copied in monasteries, and the psalters brought from overseas as gifts or private treasures. And you may naturally wonder why I want to quote myself and Åslaug. That's normally not the done thing. But I would like to make 2 points with this quotation, and that is that the remains of the medieval Nordic book culture, that is the fragments that we now have, shares so many features and traits with the other medieval Western Latin books and fragments. And on the other hand, on the top of that, there are naturally some strange Nordic features, as we can see later on. So this is our starting point. And I would like to argue that these Nordic collections are actually some kind of a dream come true for a fragmentologist, because there are lots of fragments. In fact, the vast majority of medieval books that were used in the Nordic countries during the Middle Ages and were still in use when the Reformation came in the 1520s, the vast majority of those books only actually exist as fragments. And hence, it is the fragments that are the key to reconstructing and understanding the medieval book culture on the edge of Latinitas, that is in the Nordic countries. And in many respects, these fragments that we have, they are different from those of most other European fragment collections. They differ from those in format. We have those tiny fragments that many European collections have from book bindings and so on. But above all, we have rather big, sizable fragments of whole folia, of bifolia, and so on. And in addition to that, the content is somewhat different from these other European collections. And further on, I would like to argue that the study of the Nordic fragments can actually contribute to studying various genres that are only rather modestly present in other European collections. And this is actually my favorite example from the late Middle Ages. Around 1400, there were roughly 20,000 churches in England. At the same time, in Finland, there were roughly 100 parishes, less than 100 churches. And today, there are less than 100 existing missals from England, whereas we have remains of 359 missals from Finland. And naturally, this is not the whole truth. And this is maybe something else than truth as well. But it is actually quite telling. These numbers are actually quite telling, I think, of the treasures that we have, they are not kind of whole intact treasures. We only have remains. We have a couple of leaves of some missal there, maybe 100 leaves of another missal here, and so on. But still, we have the keys to kind of seeing and understanding what kind of missals were being used in Finland in this very modest literary milieu in the Middle Ages. And having said that, it is logical to ask, what do we actually have in the 5 Nordic countries in their fragment collections? As is logical, every Nordic country has its own collections, even though, for instance, the contents of the Swedish and Finnish collections, they actually stem from the same origin. And so do the Norwegian, Icelandic, and Danish fragments. So there are actually 2 main corpora, as it were, within these Nordic fragment collections. And as you can see, there are many, many fragments. The definition of a fragment is questionable. I don't have a very good answer to that. But we have counted that according to one definition, we have roughly around 50,000 fragments in the Nordic collections. And the biggest of the Nordic collections is by far that in Stockholm, in the National Archives, and they have counted that they have roughly 22,700 fragments, and that is around 40,000 fragment leaves. Whereas we in Helsinki, we have roughly 1,600 fragment units. Those are already partly kind of reconstructed book units, as it were, and we have around 9,400 leaves. So this gives you an idea of the size of these collections. And as I said, we have roughly 50,000 fragments, and we estimate that they come from at least 15,000 medieval books. And that is actually probably quite a handsome number of those books that were there in the early 16th century in the Nordic countries. So these collections are actually surprisingly representative, we, the Nordic scholars, like to argue. What kind of material we have? It comes as no surprise that when we try to calculate the various genres that we have based on the hitherto reconstructed books in the Swedish, Finnish, and Norwegian book collections or fragment collections, the liturgy is by far the most important, the most sizable part of those collections. And in the Nordic countries, especially in Finland, that was Christianized and brought to Latinitas and brought to book culture, actually, as the last area of the Nordic countries. In Finland, it was first and foremost the liturgical works that were needed. Who owned the books in Finland? It was the churches and parish priests and the closest circle of the bishop and so on. But when we have an overall view on the Nordic collections, in addition to liturgy, we also have law fragments, we have theological treatises as fragments, we have Bibles, and we have something else like hagiography and stuff like that. But it is the liturgy that is by far the most important genre, at least when it comes to sheer numbers. Why do we have so many fragments in the Nordic countries? I will tell you the story from the Swedish and Finnish viewpoint. And the story was actually really similar in the other Nordic parchment fragment corpus, namely that from Denmark and Norway, but I will focus on Sweden and Finland now. That is in these areas here. And at that time, Sweden consisted of 7 bishoprics, and one of them was the bishopric of Åbo. Åbo is the Swedish name, and Turku is the Finnish name. And the bishopric, the diocese of Turku or Åbo, it actually covered the whole area of present Finland. Well, not the northern parts, but the southern and mid part of present-day Finland. So it was a very, very big bishopric, but as I already told you, it only had like 100 parishes by the end of the Middle Ages, so it was not a very populated one. You are the experts of European parchment fragments, and you know that fragments can come in many forms, like on a plate here. This is just a picture of a postcard that I bought in a Dutch museum, and I was so thrilled when I saw that there is actually a parchment fragment here on the plate. There's probably, I don't know what one would have eaten together with the oysters, but there's some, I don't know, pepper or something. But this was not the typical use to use medieval books in Sweden and Finland. Finland, of course, part of Sweden then. And we have this guy to thank for the wonderfully big number of parchment fragments today. He's the King of Sweden, Gustav I, who was the king when the Reformation began in the 1520s. And he was very much for the Reformation in his realm. He didn't like to obey Pope and the Catholic bishops, and he tried to modernize his realm. And for that, he needed money. And he thus confiscated much of the riches of the church and the bishops. And he also confiscated the books of every parish, every church, every monastery, every bishopric, and so on. And he was a very, very frugal king. And naturally, he could have destroyed the books because they did not serve any religious purpose anymore after Reformation. Because in the Nordic countries, as in elsewhere, one of the main points of the Reformation was that one was to use one's mother tongue in the church. And naturally, most of these liturgical books were written in Latin, these medieval ones, so they had no purpose anymore as it came to the contents. But of course, most of them were written on very durable parchment, leather, that is. And hence, Gustav and his advisors came to the idea that we could actually recycle these books. And what they did, they detached the books. I don't know if you can, well, it is probably obvious for you how to detach bifolia from a book, but I have a book here, and you just take the double leaves, the bifolia, and tear them apart from the book. And this is what the bailiffs of King Gustav did. And after that, the parchment fragments, they were already fragments, they were recycled and used as the cover wrappings, parchment cover wrappings of the bailiffs' account books. And as you can see, we have the medieval text here. The page is actually upside down due to the broad under margin that could be used for this new text. And as you can see, it's Bertil Jönsson's Räkenskap för Europe Herald, pro anno 1559. So it's Bailiff Bertil Jönsson's accounts from Europe area that is on the Karelian Isthmus in Russia today. So this was the typical way of recycling medieval books in the 16th century until around 1630. And it is through these mechanics that we have so many parchment fragments even today. Even though 1/3 of these accounts and their cover wrappings they have been lost during the centuries due to fires and all kinds of damages, but we still have a very, very handsome number of these fragments. And in Finland, actually, already in the mid-19th century, the scholars took these cover wrappings, these parchment leaves, apart from the actual accounts. And the accounts in Finland are at our national archives today, and these cover wrappings are at our national library. Whereas in Sweden, the accounts are still covered by these medieval parchment cover wrappings, and they are located in the National Archives in Stockholm. And these fragments have now been studied for more than 150 years in all Nordic countries, but it has been during the last decade or so that we have come up with new results. Now we can, thanks to modern technology and thanks to the wonderful contributions of the previous scholarly generations, we can now have an overview of what we have, and we can kind of try to reconstruct a rather detailed big picture of our oldest book culture, as it were. And in all the Nordic countries, there are some kind of parchment fragment databases, and the biggest two are actually the Swedish and the Finnish one. And for instance, Jaakko and Tuija were part of the group that contributed to this Finnish Fragmenta Membranea database, and it may not be the nicest looking database that is available, but it is a wonderful resource. We have every parchment fragment that we have in Finland photographed there, and you have all the information that we scholars have on every individual fragment there. So if you want to study the parchment fragments that are located in Finland today, this is the place to start. And you can download all the fragments in wonderfully high resolution and so on. And on the Swedish side, they have at the Riksarkivet, their national archives, this MPO database, Medeltida pergamentomslag database, and it is equally nice. They don't have yet pictures of all the fragments, but on the other hand, their descriptions are very meticulously done. It is a really wonderful resource as well. So there are already wonderful resources available if you want to study the Nordic parchment fragments. And as I said, the Norwegians and the Danish, they have their own databases. They are not yet this big, but they are already existing. I will come back to this in a while. But before that, I would like to share you some of my thoughts about the earliest book culture in the light of parchment fragments in Finland. And naturally, when I say in the light of parchment fragments, that is already a restriction. We all know that not all books in the late Middle Ages were written or printed on parchment, and we have next to nothing left of the paper books So there might be some kind of distortion in our picture of our book culture when we try to reconstruct it with the aid of the existing parchment fragments. But this is all we have. We have to do something with the fragments. Finland is an interesting case in the sense that we did not have any pre-existing written culture prior to the arrival of the church and its Latin books in the 11th and 12th centuries. And this is the picture that you can see is actually from the early 15th century sarcophagus of our national saint, Saint Henry, who was, according to his legend anyway, an English bishop who came to Finland from Uppsala with the Swedish king. And he's the guy down here naturally baptizing the Finns. And he came here together with the Swedish king, Saint Eric, and they converted the land according to the medieval story anyway, and brought books with them, as you can see. And unlike the other areas of Sweden who had runic stones, for instance, and stuff like that, we did not have apparently any pre-existing book culture. And that is why Finland is such an interesting case, because we can study the impact of the written word during the Middle Ages in vitro, as it were, because, well, exactly as I've already pointed out, these guys, the missionaries, came with the books, and there were no books before them. Well, in addition to books, we have all kinds of curious material. We have these some of these letters written on birch bark, the outer layer of this birch wood. And you can actually, I hope you can see that there are actually some letters. It looks like textualis of some kind. I have never been able to read the text, so if someone can do that, I would be really happy. But here on the other picture, you can see that we have some items in which there are runic letters. So this is actually both of these items that you can now see, they were found in the archaeological excavations of Turku. That was the episcopal see of Finland during the Middle Ages, and these items, they date from the early 15th century or so, according to the archaeologists. And the interesting thing in this picture with this kind of wooden plate, as it were, is that we have runic letters, but we have a Latin text. So it was Ave Maria, Gratia Plena, Dominus Tecum, and so on. So we have all kind of interesting hybrids, as it were. But if we want to understand what was really going on in the written world and book culture, it is actually the fragments that are key to understanding all aspects of book culture in Finland, because we have a couple of dozen extant codices, as you can see, but they are really, really low in number in comparison to the number of books that are reconstructible from parchment fragments. We estimate that we have fragments from roughly 1,500 books in the Finnish collections. And naturally, it is by no means certain that all of them were used in Finland, because during the 16th and 17th century, these Baylis accounts and their cover wrappings, they were sent to Stockholm to the Royal Archives, and later on, after the Swedes had lost Finland to Russia in 1809, the archivalia that had something to do with the Finnish part of the ex-Swedish realm, they had to be brought back to Finland according to the peace treaty. And it was not that nicely done. So we still have some material in Stockholm that has to do with some Finnish parishes, for instance, and vice versa. So it was not a clear cut, as it were. But still, what I would like you to remember from this picture is that it is the fragments that count when we try to shape a big and detailed picture of the whole. And based on the fragments, we can actually reconstruct 4 steps of book culture in Finland. First was the arrival of book culture in the 11th to early 13th century. And at that point, our books dating from that time, they are mostly imports from England, Germany, and France. And naturally, you now ask, could they be imports of later dates? Could they be imported in, say, 15th century? Naturally, that is possible. We have some fragments that testify to a use in Finland pretty early, already during the 14th century or so. So at least one part of these earliest fragments that we have were actually imported to Finland pretty early, but that may by no means be the case with all of those early fragments. But this seems to be the first step. And it is actually quite logical because there was no book production in Finland. There was no book production at that point in the other areas of the Swedish realm, what we now call Sweden. And hence it was logical to, and it was necessary to import books from elsewhere. The next step, the second step, would then be the broadening of the book culture. And that would then testify itself as fragments of books that were made, produced in within the Swedish realm, that is in the western parts that we now call Sweden. And that is as well a very logical step. As soon as the Swedish book production was in the state that they could produce books for the needs of the bishoprics of and readers and learned men of the own realm, it was natural and it was logical to produce books for the Finnish bishopric as well. The third step would then be the need for first local literary works, and this is to say that the legend of the local apostle Saint Henry, whom we already saw in the picture, was written in the late 13th century in Turku by the Episcopal See, probably by someone who had learned to write and had become very erudite somewhere else, in other parts of Sweden or even somewhere else, Germany or England or who knows. It's a pretty nice piece of work. It is a very typical hagiographical text, and it is also very typical that the very first local literary work, as it were, was about the local apostle. When we compare this Finnish case with the cases in, say, Bohemia, Poland, Hungary, it is exactly the same pattern that we have there. And the next step, the fourth step, was then the very, very modest beginning of the local book production. And we have some witnesses of local book production already from the late 14th century, but especially from the early 15th century onwards. And at that point, we have some centers of writing, scriptoria, maybe they could be called scriptoria, I don't know, that were able to kind of satisfy the need for books, even locally. And one should not forget that all the time there were, in addition to these steps, still imports from other parts of Latinitas. Young Finns and Swedes who went to study in Paris or Italy or Germany, they came back with books, and hence we have some really interesting, really early 13th century fragments with Parisian learning and stuff like that. So one should not forget that all the time there were these other imports as well. And just to show you some fragments, these are actually quite typical fragments in our Finnish collection. You can see this is actually made from two pictures, which may be a bit stupid for our purposes, but you can see that this English one, this fragment on the right hand side, it is actually bifolium, and this German one is probably, it is now cropped, but it was probably just a singleton. But you can see that there is material that has German traits, there is some material that has English traits, and these two fragments would, for instance, belong to the very first step of these steps of book culture that I discussed previously. And when we then go to the fourth step and try to locate the scriptoria or centers of writing in Finland, first you can see that these tiny marks, these quadrangles with small crosses on the top of them, they are parishes. And then we have castles, we have convents and monastery, actually only one monastery in the bishopric. We have some towns and so on. But you can see that it is essentially only in the southern part of Finland and southwestern part, above all, that was kind of included in the written culture. It was there that the parishes were mostly located. It was here that the bishop had his see, and it was here in Naantali that was the location of the only actual monastery in the diocese. And it is actually here that we can find these centers of writing in Naantali, the local Bridgettine monastery, in Turku by the bishop's see, and then in Viipuri, and it was the only place in which there were two mendicant convents within the same city. So as you can see, it was really, really modest literary milieu, even by the end of the Middle Ages. This corresponds to the state around 1500. And just to give you some idea of how these local fragments look like, this is a fragment from the 15th century, and our group has come to the conclusion that it was written in Turku, probably at the Dominican convent of St. Olaf. And as you can see, it is somewhat clumsily made. It's not a very nice, not a very wonderful manuscript, but you could read it, you could use it. So it was, if you just needed to have a missal, this could do. It is fairly nice. And then we have the Bridgettine monastery in Naantali, and here we actually have a rare occasion within our collection that we have two manuscripts that actually share the same page, and they were probably written, they were copied from the same exemplar, and as you can see, the writing is very, very similar from one manuscript to another. The big R initial is pretty similar, the notation is similar, and so on. And we have argued, above all, Jaakko Tahkokallio, who actually found this group of manuscripts, that this may actually have been written, these may actually have been written by the nuns of this Bridgettine monastery, due to the fact that the script is so similar, because the nuns only learned to write within the monastery, and hence their writing would have been pretty similar from one writer to another. Okay, we are moving towards the conclusion, and I would like to pose the rhetoric question, what next, or what is cooking now? And actually, our reconstruction work continues. We have been doing that since 1850s, well, not me personally, but our colleagues, and we shall probably be doing that in, well, at least in 2050s and even later on. It is a tedious work, but it pays off. And it is like a giant jigsaw puzzle that gets easier when we have more kind of pieces on their places, but it is still a big challenge, and everyone is invited to help us with that. So we still continue the reconstruction work, and we are actually doing, and we have done radiocarbon dating of a selection of these fragments, and it is another approach to this collection, and the National Library of Finland was kind enough to let us take some samples. They are just like 3 to 5 square millimeters, so they are really tiny bits, and our aim has been to delimit the sample size so that they could become even tinier in the future. And we originally wanted to kind of contribute to calibrating the traditional paleographical and codicological dating of these fragments, because we have next to no cases in which we have a date on the fragments. And it would be really interesting to know if this kind of paleographic and codicological dating could be calibrated in a way with the aid of these radiocarbon datings. We shall see. And at the moment we are also studying parchment DNA, and that is a non-invasive thing that we do. Our colleague Tuuli Kasso is here actually taking a sample, and it doesn't harm the manuscript at all. And we hope to find out what kind of animals were used as parchment in Finland, and so on. And as you can see, this is actually not a Finnish fragment, not a fragment with that was actually written in Finland. But we shall see. This is really much a work in progress project. We just took the samples 2 weeks ago, and it still takes some time, but it's interesting. And on the top of that, I would like to say that Jaakko Tahkokallio, whom I have already mentioned several times, he just got an European Research Council project that will concentrate on the missals of this Helsinki collection. So there will be more news in very near future, I hope. And as all the Nordic countries already have some kind of a national fragment database, our logical next step is naturally to plan joining them together. And we are having a Nordic workshop on that topic in January, and hopefully after that we can actually proceed with that, because that would really be on the European level a wonderful resource to have these 50,000 fragments on one database. And I would like to urge you to give us all pieces of advice you only can, because many of you already are very experienced in creating databases and joining them together and so on. So either today or via email later on or via Zoom, I would be really, really happy to discuss these things further with you. I started with a quotation, and I would like to end with another platitude, and it is as follows. In the north, normal features of medieval written culture merged with local traits to form a picture that is in many ways thoroughly familiar to a scholar of the European Middle Ages, but also surprising and exciting, opening up new aspects on the versatility of medieval literacy. And I sincerely hope that this presentation has been able to show some of the new aspects, and I'm really looking forward to collaborating with you in very, very near future. And I would like to thank you.
Thank you indeed. That was most enlightening. We will now proceed to the question part of this, and there are basically, we have already a series of questions in the chat. Christoph Fluhler had a few questions. One of them was a comment, and that was when you're talking about the Nordic tradition of with 50,000 fragments for 15,000 codices. And his question was more, is this the unusual aspect of the Nordic collections, or is it simply that the lack of books has driven Nordic scholars to do so much work with the fragments?
I think it's very much the latter. We don't have that many codices, especially not in Finland or in Norway. In Iceland, they have these wonderful saga manuscripts, but they have been studying them for generations. And I don't know if there are so many novelties one can find anymore. Probably there are many, but maybe I'm just ignorant. But in the case of Finland and Norway especially, it is the lack of the whole codices that has driven us to study the parchment fragments. And in Sweden and Denmark, they have wonderful collections of medieval whole books. But since Denmark shares the fragments with Norway and Sweden shares the fragments with Finland, it is kind of logic that we are working together.
Okay, thank you. Marie-Louise Heckman had a question. Did you want to ask that question yourself?
I would like to know whether there is any ink, to look for the inks, whether it is a way to collect different fragment groups.
Yeah, that would certainly be possible. I think we haven't done that apart from the kind of ordinary codicological viewpoints, that if we see a special kind of ink or a very bad ink that is barely visible, for instance, we make a mental note and then we can combine it with something else. But naturally, there would be kind of scientific ways of studying inks. And for instance, the British scholar Michael Gallick, he has been very eager to study the colors of the initials, for instance, in the Swedish and the Finnish, and especially in the Norwegian collections. So that would be one way to proceed, I guess.
Okay, and I have here another, looks like it's a question/exchange between Christoph Fluhler and Anna Adamska, which is, Christoph was asking about the some more clarification on distinction between written culture and book production, saying that the 14th century is very late for book production. So does this mean the written culture started then, or just book production? He makes a reference to Novgorod, where there are birch bark manuscripts from the 9th to the 15th century. And Anna Adamska asks, rather makes a statement that this can be relative, and maybe there's these peripheries, the Latinitas have their own chronology, and then we should consider when written culture was introduced and how much time is needed to build up the basic infrastructure of literacy. So would you have a comment on that to be able to add?
I think written culture and book culture are two different things. And as to the birch bark letters from Novgorod, there are some from the 13th century that have something to do with Finland, in the sense that it is kind of very early Finnish that has been written in some of the letters. But well, the written culture started when the church came. So we have ecclesiastical documents from the early 13th century and so on. And by that time, and where the missionaries came, when the missionaries came in the 11th and 12th centuries, they certainly had books with them, and probably some of the books remained in Finland. But as to the own book production, it apparently took pretty much time to gather the know-how, and I don't know, maybe there was not such a high need for books for many centuries.
Okay, thank you. Looks like Laura Albiero has a follow-up question of that sort. She asks, you showed that part of the manuscripts were imported from Germany, France, and England. What about the local paleographical features of locally produced manuscripts? Did the scribes develop their own style, or did they adopt features from abroad? And what about the local liturgical tradition?
Some huge questions, but thank you. Wonderful questions, Laura, as well. Yeah, certainly they tried to follow the international model, and they probably tried to do as fancy manuscripts as they could with the means that they had, with the schooling that they had, with the materials that they had, and for the audience that they had. Probably, well, there probably was not that much book trade, for instance, but when, for instance, the bishop saw that there were some liturgical manuscripts missing in one parish, then he would order some manuscripts to be bought or some manuscripts to be written. As to the liturgical traits, naturally, the diocese had its liturgical traits. It was not that different from the other parts of the Swedish realm, but naturally every diocese and actually every parish in the Middle Ages had their own liturgy. So that's applied to Finland as well. And as to the paleographic traits, well, we have been trying to identify those to be able to kind of reconstruct manuscripts on one hand and to reconstruct manuscript groups on the other hand. So there has been really much this good old-fashioned paleographic work.
We have a comment evidently from Lisa Fagan-Davis. Says that as more of such national surveys of fragments take place, I find myself thinking more and more about the national narratives of fragmentation. The story of fragmentation is different in Finland, as it's different from a story in Italy or France, UK or Germany. The story in the US is predicated on the book trade and collecting practice, while the UK is more about the impact of the Reformation. It would be interesting to bring together a collection of essays on these national corpora and their stories.
Yeah, I agree. Count me in.
Yeah.
May I just advertise this book by Åslaug Ommundsen and myself? Well, we were the editors, and there was a group of dozen other writers, and one of our points was to kind of tell this Nordic story, and it was pretty similar from one country to another, but certainly very, very different from Germany or England or Italy, as you point out, Lisa.
I will send you an email.
Okay, looking forward to that.
Wonderful. We have Christina Solidoro asks, do you observe a significant number of reused fragments whose text was totally erased from the external face if they were used as covers?
No, they didn't bother doing that. There might be one or two cases, but I can't remember any. I don't know if you, Jaakko or Tuija, can you remember any of those cases?
Sorry, you mean completely erased? Text
Yeah.
completely erased? Yeah. No, not completely. They sometimes scraped off a little bit to make space for the rubric, but I don't think that they ever erased like systematically anything.
Okay. All right. Thank you. We have the next question is a quick one from Peter Toth. Is there a medieval vernacular Finnish language and literature fragments preserving texts? Those texts, do they exist? So he's asking, do you have any vernacular stuff?
That's a very good question, and many scholars have been looking for that, especially in the 19th century during the very, very nationalistic period, when it would have been a jackpot to find a very early Finnish manuscript, but they actually didn't find anything. We know that something has existed. We know that from the inventories of some parishes that there was something in Finnish. They have some books in Finnish, but we don't have anything left from the Middle Ages, and that could then imply that those books were written on paper. Who knows? But I don't know. I will tell you if we find one.
Okay, and from Matthias Tischler writes, contrast Northern world, Southern world. Spain and Catalonia had no true Reformation, and at least in Catalonia we have thousands of fragments produced since the 16th century. The reasons were more than the new book trade, the massive need of parchment, the high rate of writing activities of the notaries, and of course the liturgical form of the Council of Trento.
Yeah, that's very true. And it is actually interesting that the Reformation came to the Nordic countries that early that I don't know if it probably already affected book production in a way, because we had some books printed for the Swedish realm and its dioceses, and even for the Diocese of Turku, some liturgical works, but it was kind of, the Reformation came pretty soon after that.
Okay, and we have a final question here as we're coming to the end of our hour. It's from Godfried Krunen, who asks, in the context of the Nordic countries, why do these sagas so often survive in complete codices rather than in fragments?
Well, I'm not a saga expert, so I'm only guessing, but I guess they would not have been confiscated by the crown, because there were no liturgical books, and it was mainly the liturgical books and the books of the ecclesiastical entities like monasteries and convents and so on that were confiscated and reused. So that's why those were not reused, I would guess. And they probably had private owners. That's my understanding.
Okay. Well, I wanted to thank you again, Professor Heikkilä, for a very enlightening talk. And thank you all for attending, and just make a little bit of announcement for our next scheduled video conference is the 15th of January, when Dr. Laura Alidori of the University of Lausanne will speak on the reconstruction of CNE's Trecento choir book cycles. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you the next time.
Thank you very much. Let's keep in touch, and Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.